Welcome to the podcast, everybody. My name's Paul. This is Simon joining us again. Jake is on holiday.
Again. How did we give him so much holiday? It's like,
To be fair, he didn't have a single day's holiday last year. He worked really hard, so he deserves every single moment.
Absolutely.
Something a bit different this week. We're not going to be talking about too much about bikes. We're going to be talking about training. A couple of things that have happened. One, the Spring Classics have been yielding some superhuman effort.
Absolutely. You see Van der Poel finishing with an average time of 44.5 kilometres an hour. I mean, that's phenomenal.
That's insane.
I think Pogacar was 44.1 when he finished last year, but I mean, these are phenomenal times.
And a lot of that was spent solo as well, which is even mind-blowing. You can imagine a peloton doing those sort of speeds, but just incredible. And drug testing has got a whole lot better, so it's but so has sports science got a whole lot better.
I think that's, often people trying to pose the question, how come the peloton's riding so much faster? And there's a number of reasons for that, we believe. But I mean, I think a lot of it comes down to the data, the research, and how they're training, how they're really embracing that data to inform very informed training, which is very effective for each individual rider, as opposed to it's a generic one-size-fits-all, very personalised, looking at the data, taking that data and then making corrective decisions.
It's definitely not a decade's worth of aero bikes telling you can save 3 watts at 40 kph for the last 10 years.
No.
Accumulating into free speed, I don't think. It's definitely there's a lot of science now, isn't there? There's a whole bunch of really interesting stuff. Even talking to G down at Roulier, he was talking about like how they're calculating how much water he's carrying to doing certain hill stages and all sorts. And the sports science is insane. The reason I put all this collection of stuff on the table today is because I want to talk about some industry disruption and what we've learned in our 9-year journey of coaching people down here. Because it is a sad time. We have just finished our last ever turbo session. Sad.
Which is definitely an era, end of an era, but opens the door to a new era, and I'm kind of excited about the possibilities, Paul. So,
if it's okay, I want to reflect on a little bit on what led us here, because 9 years ago, we opened a turbo training studio using absolute state-of-the-art Tax Neos and Wahoo kickers, all connected up. All the data, all that power data, all that cadence data, all that heart rate data went through a WASP, and the WASP transmitted with a piece of software called Perfpro. And we were able to link our workups with, at the time, the Sufferfest was the really big thing before Zwift, and we could synchronize Sufferfest workouts to everyone's power data. We could do FTP tests on mass. And when we first opened 9 years ago, a power meter was like unheard of. I think I had a few customers back then who probably had SRM power meters, maybe the first generation of Quarks. And so we drew people in because it was their first ever experience of power. Like, what is my power? Well,
that's very true. I mean, because I remember getting my first power meter, which was a long time ago, and I remember, must admit, in hindsight, I was a bit ignorant in terms of what's the value of having this device. It was a cool device that I could have on my bike that told me how much power I was putting out. Great, fantastic. But to be honest, I really hadn't appreciated all the intricacies of what it was telling me and how to use that. For example, things like intensity factor, what did that mean and how should I relate to that, etc. And things like, variability index, etc. All these things were like, I never really thought about. I was just looking at this part and thinking, listening to my friends I ride with, and they're going, well, you got to have an FTP of X, so therefore I've got to get more power.
Yeah.
So it wasn't very scientific. It was more of a vanity thing, if I'm honest.
Yeah, I think that's true. When we first started getting people down here, they were just competing to see who had the most power, not really thinking about power to weight or lactate thresholds or power in zones or anything like that. And a lot of the first 18 months of us being open, we were doing a lot of education, because the screens were beaming up all like intensity factor and TSS and watts per kilograms and the calories, and people like, how does it know how many kilojoules I've got? And then educating people how we transferred watts to kilojoules to calories. And so we took our whole audience through a massive journey. And in its peak downstairs, we had 12 turbo trainers, sometimes even more than that. We had a couple at the back sometimes, which didn't work out that well. And we were doing 2, maybe 3 classes every single night of the week. It was hugely popular, and thanks to anyone who's listening that came along to those sessions, because the vibe was
it's great to see amazing. The atmosphere. I mean, I've got a lot of sweat going on and some loud music pumping away, but a great atmosphere and a lot of people getting a lot of value from it. Absolutely.
It was some really, really happy days of running those classes. And a couple of things happened. Well, a few things have happened actually that have led to what was a disruptive industry. We were the first people to do scientific group training, was one, the bikes got more complicated. So people used to bring their own bike, and we had 9, 10, maybe 11 speed, all on quick releases. Sometimes if someone brought a disc brake bike, and it was relatively easy to do a class switch over.
Yeah.
And all of a sudden we had, 10 mil through axles, 12 mil through axles, disc brakes, non-disc brakes, 9, 10, and then we had 12. Oh my God. And trying to prepare a class just became a logistical nightmare.
I can imagine.
So that was bad. And then probably the big death knell for it was COVID, if I'm being completely honest. There was an explosion in turbo trainer ownership, which you probably witnessed.
Well, yeah, I mean, I had one before, but I definitely double down on my use of my turbo trainer at home. And again, it was a bit like the power meter stuff. Okay, I've got this turbo trainer at home. I can ride at home. I can jump onto environments like Zwift and I can kind of smash it out. And there was time trials going on. I think the club, we had a number of teams racing every Wednesday night, and it was like, oh, great, this is great. But is this the most effective way of training? It didn't really dawn on me till later that I could be more effective in how I'm training and how I'm using these tools.
Yeah, I think you were probably an early adopter to the whole Zwift thing. And then through COVID, you probably saw more and more people join your community, and
absolutely,
racing took off massively. And then we saw people buying turbo trainers. And once you brought a very expensive turbo trainer, it's kind of a thing, isn't it? It's in your house. It's like, I've kind of spent.
You kind of feel obliged to use it. Yeah,
you've got your Zwift subscription that goes out every month and stuff, a bit like a gym membership. So there was that element. The other element for us was that Sufferfest got bought by Wahoo, and they withdrew the licenses. So studios like us weren't allowed to use the Wahoo, the Sufferfest license anymore, which is a real shame. We still made our own workouts and made it entertaining. And the other thing that happened really was the software. Perfpro got bought by a company called Vision something. I'm gonna have to look that up now.
I'm not sure.
I'm not quite sure who they got brought by. But anyway, they were definitely focusing on getting what we were doing downstairs, lots of data all going up to a central coach. The coach would be able to review everyone's data, but they're trying to do it on a worldwide scale. So you dial into your coach and there'd be one coach, and fantastic. It's not really my vibe. I kind of wanted to try and get into remote coaching. It didn't excite me, if I'm being completely honest. And so, we came out of COVID. Social distancing meant that we only had 6 turbo trainers. That's a bit weird because you miss out on the vibe then.
Yeah, it didn't have the same vibe afterwards.
And it wasn't very educational. So we invested in things like this. We're like, well, okay, power disrupted the industry. What's going to be the next disruptor? What do we really want to learn? And what we were finding was that the Zwifters, as we call them, were coming to us with questions. Like, I've been training on Zwift, I do all these sessions, but my FTP is stuck at this number. I'm not getting any faster. I'm always tired. I'm not really sure how to fuel it. I haven't made much progress. And so we started to test.
Well, that's the key point. Yeah, we're starting to open people's eyes to what we should test and why we're testing it and what's the value of it. And obviously, the challenge then is once you've done the testing is, do people take that information and go and do something meaningful with it, or do they just ignore it and revert back to what they were doing? And that's all part of the education process.
Yeah, and what we found actually, testing is really interesting because the second you put the word test on something, everyone gets really anxious about performance. When actually, fitness testing is about giving you answers.
That's why I personally like to use the word assessment. So
yes.
I've often, I have a coach and I do some stuff, and when it comes to a test, I start the test and my heart rate's probably more elevated than it would normally be because I'm thinking it's a test.
I've got to get a number.
I've got to get a number and I've got to perform well because, I want to see I'm progressing, blah, blah, blah. But that's why I try to think of it more of an assessment because it's a continuous assessment, and then you can obviously take the results of that assessment and apply it to your training plan.
Yeah, the idea of all of this is not to know how good you are, it's to say, how do we get better? Like, what's the thing, how is your body operating right now, and what bit of your training should be focused on to get them.
And I think it's really important that, because of the type of people that have been coming to our facility here, it's not all about elite athletes. I mean, this is about anybody that's cycling at any level or running or whatever, that really wants to just be much more effective in terms of how they're participating in that, whether it's a ride further, whether it's to do a sportif in a quicker time, or to be able to go and do a more aggressive sportif that's got more climbing, like come and do the Fred Whitten with all the electric climbs, and be able to successfully get around that.
It's a good point actually, because downstairs I looked at some of the stats that we had. We've had something like 600 athletes go through our doors, and there's something like 50,000 individual workouts in our database, ranging from 12-year-old to 82, I think, is our oldest ever participant. Now, if you're an academic, you went to university, that is an insane amount of data.
Absolutely, great pool of data, yeah. Totally.
And do you know what? Probably the biggest thing for me, though, is not aside from the data, because you can accumulate that, is for every single one of those workouts, I was stood next to the athletes. And the qualitative data, my observations, my talking to the athletes is probably more valuable in my mind than the actual statistical data that came out of those.
Okay. Yeah.
Because the questions I used to get were, I'm the same size and weight as him, but why isn't my power the same? Or how come I can do 9 of these intervals, but he can do 20 or something? And you can see how people really, really try and like wrenching their heart out and just not getting the results that they want.
And I think that's the trouble. I think that's the whole, and I think it still goes on a lot in our communities, is where people are fixating on something like FTP. And I know it's kind of a bit of a cliche, we always talk about FTP, but it's understanding the bigger picture in terms of understanding really, you know, the key predictors we're looking at, which would be VO2 max, which is oxygen consumption, fatigue thresholds, which is critical power, and then efficiency and economies of movement. I mean, that's kind of key to me.
Mm-hmm. The amount of coaching, I think a lot of the time we could get an awful lot of power out of someone just by standing next to them and coaching them into a more stable pedaling position and a smoother pedaling action. And you'll be surprised. And breathing. Honestly, just coaching people how to breathe has been really powerful. And it sounds bonkers.
Oh, totally. No. It's the simple things, getting the simple things right that then enable you to progress and move on. And I think, you know, I mean, testing, as I said, I've obviously worked with a coach and we test, and I'm a huge fan, and I know there's a lot of talk in the industry, you know, out there in the community about Zone 2 and riding in Zone 2, but I've probably been riding it for many years. I'm a huge fan of getting the right balance, making sure you get that 80-20, particularly through winter. I mean, for me, it's what you do in the winter that determines how effective your season's going to be. Mm-hmm. You know, you get a good winter, get a good base, then you're going to have a fantastic season, whether it's racing or doing sportives or whatever you want to do.
Yeah, and that's a good point, actually, because our entire business model revolved around the concept of reverse periodization, which is we do our intensity in the winter because that suits our business model as much as anything else, and it's still effective. Even research has proved that it's still effective. So you might not be able to do all the big long hours outdoors, but you can come to a turbo training session, get a big intensive session, and then about now when the weather starts to get a bit better, you go out and do all your endurance. And we still created some incredibly fit people who are really educated about pacing and all sorts. So yeah, I do look back on it because I'm not from a sports science background originally. My educational background is all about coaching and education and stuff. So I found it great to be able to sit next to people, but I really had to learn sports science. My undergraduate degree had an element of sports science in it, so I wasn't like completely starting from scratch, but a lot of this was just learning as I went, from answering people's questions and diving into the research and just getting really involved in it because I love coaching. Sure. And the conversation naturally went quite scientific. And
what's really inspired me of what we've been working on recently is, I mean, I'm more used to more traditional methods, I guess you could call them traditional, in terms of, so I talked about my Zone 2. So in order to know effectively ride Zone 2, you know, I'd really need to know where my kind of lactate turn point 1 is. And typically we would go on and we do a particular set of tests and take a prick in the finger if you can get some blood, or in the ear, and you're desperately trying to get blood and you can't get it. Well, then the blood all comes rushing out. So it's a little bit of pain. But that was great. It determines those thresholds. I mean, I was particularly looking for LT1, LT2, etc. And that enabled me to then be able to train diligently within that Zone 2. And then if I was doing other sessions, I was training within the right zones there as well. But, you know, with the Moxie system that we're now starting to use, this makes life a lot easier, I believe. I mean, in terms of testing and continuous testing.
Just picking up on that point, I used to do lactate testing, which is, I've stopped doing it, but because it's messy. And there's a couple of things where you'll probably know. I think you need to be quite well practiced, not just the coach taking the blood, but also the athlete having the blood taken. It needs to be a bit of practice, because you're right, you're just concentrating on producing watts and power, and like there's someone walking around with a thing trying to prick your ear or your finger and then like get samples and then trying to record the results, because it's not all integrated. It's very manual, and quite often, unless you were really, really good and really well practiced, let's say you take a lactate reading every 3 minutes or something, probably a third of those wouldn't work. They'll just come out as errors, and you'd end up trying to draw lines of best fit and think about. So sometimes you'd miss the exact turn point, and I don't know. Once I discovered Moxie, I sort of pretty much turned my back on lactate, because a lot of this stuff on here is all about oxygen. Oxygen is the most important thing. Now, don't get me wrong. Like, I think lactate is still really important at certain levels, but I think this is more important, and lactate's almost the next. Like, not one other little piece of information, but not everyone has access to this.
I was going to say, so I mean, in terms of accessibility and where we see our services that we can provide, I mean, how do you see people taking advantage of this technology?
So these little things really changed my life, to be honest. How I coach, how I talk to people, how we assess people, and because they're continuous, it's a bit like having the opposite of a lactate reading, but continuous.
So it's probably worth just, these are sensors that sit on the muscle.
Yep.
And then they're looking at kind of near infrared spectrometry.
Yep.
Yeah. So what does that really mean then, Paul?
So this beams like a little near infrared light into your adipose tissue, and then it records what bounces back, either light red or dark red, or send back a different signal. So from that you can get a count of what they call the total hemoglobin, actually how many things are reflecting some light.
Yeah.
And you can measure that in milliliters. And then it can tell you the percentage of what's carrying oxygen and what isn't.
Okay.
So as your body starts to consume oxygen, you'll see a thing called desaturation. Your oxygen saturation will drop. So you might say, we're sitting here right now, probably your body always likes to find a state of homeostasis. So we're probably at 50%. So 50% carbon dioxide, 50% oxygen. Yeah. Now, if we would start doing star jumps, that would go down. Our body would try to access instant oxygen. And then we would have a response. Our heart rate would rise and our breathing rate would rise to try and replenish that oxygen. And we get to see that in the data. We'll see that initial drop, then we'll see that rise. Now, if we keep training at an unsustainable level to the point where our body can't replace the oxygen, we will see declines of various rates. So not only do you get to see the actual score, you actually get to see the velocity of a desaturation and a resaturation, which I think is the most telling, because it can tell you how quickly you are consuming that oxygen. So
that would be key if for example, if you were accelerating up a hill or something, and it's how quickly you can kind of get that back.
Yeah, and how quickly your cardiorespiratory system then responds to try and refuel it.
Right.
And which is the really interesting thing for me, because I think most people can sprint and deplete their oxygen quite quickly, but a really well-trained athlete will be able to elevate all their responses and start getting oxygen back in there. So,
and the key thing is, you can just put these under your shorts and just ride. There's no wires or heavy gadgets that follow them.
And you could have loads as well. We've got 6 of these. So we could have one on various working muscles. So a time trialist might be more on their sort of vastus lateralis. A cyclist might be more on, they start at the front of the quad. But you can also put them on your glute as well. And we also use them on the non-working muscle. So you can put them onto your triceps or whatever. And the reason why we might do that is we get an idea of how your body is prioritizing blood flow. Because your body will always try and give oxygen to your vital organs first to try and keep you alive. And then it will try and give you oxygen to the working muscle. And then it will start closing down capillaries to the stuff that it really doesn't need it. So to prioritize those two things. So as you go through the intensity, not only do you get to see the rate of desaturation, but you also get to see how that's different around the body and what's working and what's not. And then you get a really good picture of someone's health.
It's not just a snapshot, it's a whole more holistic view then.
And
then so what would you do with that data? What does that data tell you at that point then?
So with these data combined with a heart rate monitor as well, we can then start drawing some really strong hypotheses, which we can then later with the masks. And that's in terms of what is the limiter? What is the thing that's holding you back? Is it your cardiac response, your pulmonary ability, or is it your muscle oxidative capacity, i.e. how quickly your mitochondria can do something?
So this is going back to the point before where people obsess about things, but everybody's different. Everybody's physiologically, biomechanically is different. And so this is identifying what is the limiter that potentially needs to be worked on. And if we remove that limiter, that person will become more effective in terms of...
So the way I like to describe it to people is a bit like a coal mining situation where you imagine that the coal face is digging up the oxygen and is trying to get it into your lungs, but the train has to deliver that coal to the furnace, and the furnace has to be able to burn it. Now, in a lovely situation, that's all working in harmony. But you can imagine a situation when the mine is too effective and there's big piles of oxygen that aren't being used because the furnaces can't burn it quickly enough. Exactly the same. So you could have a really good set of healthy lungs, but if the mitochondria in your muscle cells can't actually turn it into ATP energy, then it's pointless. So then in what do you train?
Okay, so in that case, and take that as a good example, I suppose. So you might assume that that particular athlete hasn't got enough mitochondria. So then you would prescribe training. I mean, we all know, like, for example, Zone 2 is a great way of generating more mitochondria, which is going to help transport more oxygen.
Burn more oxygen.
Burn, correction,
So whereas the transportation, it might be that you can actually use all the oxygen available, you desaturate very, very quickly, and it takes your heart rate a long time. And you'll see that because the heart rate will continue to rise even at a steady state, and your heart rate is trying to, and that way we can train very high heart rate things or put your heart under a bit of stress to try and get that cardio system working a and bit more.
So and these devices, I mean, they link into the head units as well.
Yeah. You can. We're going to do this actually. We're going to go to Mallorca, and you and Hannah, who you're going to meet Hannah soon, have volunteered to do.
We did
on the bike.
I did volunteer. Yeah, so that's a good point.
So we use this in the studio quite a lot. I know you've used these in the studio. It's absolutely fascinating data. But I've only been using this with a few athletes outside recently, because I, as a coach, I want to know, I want to see the data all the time. And when it's out of my hands, it's on your head unit, I don't get to see. But I've been riding with this, and it's brilliant. Like, this, in my mind, is going to replace power meters. A bold statement.
That is a pretty bold statement, because
this potentially is more useful than a power meter.
That'll be a big day when people stop obsessing about how many watts they're putting out for 5 minutes, 20 minutes, or whatever, and we start talking about saturation or desaturation or resaturation
of muscle oxygen. Yeah, and the reason I say that is because when you're out riding, you'll see a hill, for instance, and you'll see your oxygen saturation go down, and you'll see your heart rate rise, and you'll find a state of equilibrium. And when you're static, you're pacing it well. When you're on a rate of desaturation, you know that you're going to run out at some point. You're going to run out at some point, and how quickly you run out, you can see, because you can see the number going down very slowly or very rapidly.
So there was another area, this came to my thoughts, is in terms of if you were warming up for a particular event. I mean, in my case, it might be a time trial, but it could be a crit race, it could be a sportif. This would help you ensure you start the event at the right level. Correct me if I'm wrong,
Yeah, and in fact, some of the athletes we've been working with has been developing their own secret sauce warm-ups, because what you want to do at the start line of any sort of race is to make sure that you are absolutely packed full of oxygen and you're ready to go. So you can do a warm-up, and if you warm up well by doing some really hard, intense, that really strain your muscles and bring them up, you can start a race at like 80% muscle oxygen saturation. So you just got this massive fuel tank of oxygen stored.
Ready to go. It's like the turbo boosters ready to fire. Yeah.
But you've got to time it well as well. One, you've got to do the intensity to actually generate that physiological
Which
response.
is going to be different for everybody,
Some people can do it in like 6 second spin-ups, high cadence. Some people need like a minute of slow cadence, like grinding. Right. Everyone's a bit different, and how long the rest periods are and stuff.
So again, this is like in the old days, it's like somebody would say, well, you need to warm up for this. This is what I do, and you should do this. Whereas just everything's getting much more personalised
Science. You want to be on the start line. And also how quickly your body will come back to homeostasis. You can get right back down to 50% again and completely undo your warm-up if you've left it long enough, because your body will go, I've got too much oxygen here, I don't need this.
Yeah, so somebody might leave it, 10 minutes, 15 minutes before they go to start, and that might be too much, and it's undoing the good of what they did in the warm-up. Whereas if you time it and you just go there with 2 or 3 minutes, that could be perfection.
Perfect. Yeah. And you'll learn all of that through that device. It's quite incredible.
So how does that couple with the VO2? I mean, these masks, if anybody's looking, wondering what they are.
So these, so after we started to really dig down into the oxygen, we started getting involved with VO2 Master. We're now on generation 3. This is generation 2. We've got generation 1 downstairs. Now these VO2 testing used to be for hospitals, really, 15,000, 20,000 pounds worth of oxygen testing. These were about £4,500.
It's still not cheap, and you're not probably going to buy one.
And you're still going to get them serviced every year and stuff. But these offer us pretty much the gold standard in exercise physiology.
So when you look at kind of exercise labs and you see all the headset on, you see all the tubes going, I mean, this does exactly comparable?
Kind of. Yeah. So there's a few things going on there. So one, you see on the really big labs, they'll do oxygen and CO2. This just does oxygen. Right. And also some of those that you see bring the bags, they'll be able to seal those bags up and do a proper gas analysis,
Okay,
which is where you might see traces of ammonia in your breath and that sort of thing. So this literally just does oxygen. So it's not that thing, but look at it.
But that's not a limiter, because we get a lot of useful information.
So
it's portable, and you don't have to carry any wires or cables with you. Again, you could go and ride your bike outside.
And we have done. I can put an iPhone in someone's back pocket and take the data, and they can go and ride up a hill and record that data, which is fantastic. I've done a lot of this with people who are running, because running's really hard. Because if you do it on a treadmill, it's too artificial. If you can go out on a track and actually do this with someone, on a track, is so much better. So
just using these devices then. And so if somebody wanted to determine their kind of key training parameters, like lactate 10.12, how would it work with these devices then?
So we've got to think about ventilatory turn points rather than lactate turn points. So this is picking up VT1 and VT2, which you could argue are still the same thing, but how we measure them is different. So the big thing with this is, because we know that 21% of the air is oxygen, and we're now measuring what you're breathing out, we can assume that what you're breathing out has been used in the production of energy. What we don't know from this is necessarily how much of that was an anaerobic, but we can work it out by using MOXIEs as
combining with the MOXIE.
Combining it with several bits of data as well, you get a better insight into that. Now, what this does then convert into is how many calories was actually consumed at each one of those turn points. And you can see the turn points. It's not like, how do I feel? Or I've used an algorithm to transfer, FTP into this, or even the lactate, which lactate can be very, very dependent on a lot of things, what you've eaten, for instance. Whereas with this, we can see the graph, we can see the turn points, and we can line it up with lots of other data. We can look at the data from MOXIE and say, that was the turn point. That's what happened.
So somebody could come to us, we could kit them out, we can do it in our gym, or we can go outside, and they could leave here knowing their key turn points, which then could define their training zones, and they'd know where to spend their time.
It's good so people often think that the reason you get a VO2 max test is to know what your VO2 max is. That's the least valuable piece of information.
That's another vanity thing. It's like, my FTP is X, my VO2 max is it's vanity. What good is that until you apply it and do something with it? And,
what the actual value is probably the least information, because VO2 max is a massive indicator of longevity and stuff. So having a good VO2 max, hence all the videos that I've been doing when mine went through an absolute dive, and it's I'm looking forward to showing you guys the results of that, actually, because it does not take long to get it back to something reasonable. But keep working on your VO2 max. It also degrades over with age as well. It's one of the things that
I'm fighting that
quite quickly, as we all are. But the most critical piece of information, it tells you your lung capacity, your breaths per minute. We can take a really deep dive into your stress response and see how you're breathing at certain intensities, how that corresponds to heart rate rises. We can see exactly at your zone 2 what your calorie requirement is, so you can fuel your rides.
That's another key point. That's part of it, I think, why the Pro Peloton's performing at the levels it is, because of nutrition and fueling, pre-ride, during ride, after ride. So how would this help you with your kind of nutritional strategy for in riding then?
A couple of ways. One, we can do an RMR test, which is resting metabolic rate, and we know roughly what you're going to be burning just to be a human existing through a normal day. We can combine that with how much you're using at every single level of intensity to then absolutely dial in your nutrition. And it's incredible. It can vary massively, and the fitter you get, generally the less calories that you...
Well, it's kind of interesting, because there's now, I think the figure's around 120 grams of carbohydrate per hour that the for an average person to consume that,
that'd make you sick.
It would make me sick. And we try and do that. I guess we're probably, if we're riding zone 2 about 200-ish watts, I guess we'd be burning about 700 calories an hour maybe.
It's very, very different.
Very different. And we wouldn't be all glycogen, we'd probably be a bit of fat as well. Whereas if they're banging out 400 plus watts, they're probly predominantly glycogen source.
Predominantly glycogen,
which is why they need to have this nutrition level. So sorry, I digress slightly, but so how would this help you really kind of strategize your fueling for training and racing?
Well, one, it'd help you avoid the bonk, but also it'd avoid you putting on weight. So Bradley Wiggins, very famously, when he was training for his big campaign, going from a time trial to track racing, he was using this sort of technology to really dial down and get to know exactly the amount of calories, to the point where he was weighing his food to make sure that he still had enough fuel to train hard, but then not gain weight and still being in a calorie deficit as well. That's an insane level of detail. We don't not all need that, but I think it's very enlightening for people when they do this test, and they get an idea that I'm going to be doing in the Sportive, I'm going to be riding around zone 3, zone 4 for most of all that, and this is how many calories. And you look at a bar and you're thinking, well, I need to eat 3 of these an hour.
Yeah.
And you're like, yeah, you do.
I think that's the greatest thing, I mean, I've done a number of long events, and the number of people that underestimate what they need to fuel, or they pick something that's probably not an appropriate fuel source because they think that just tastes nice and it's not the most effective way of fueling. And a number of times there's one, well, in our area it's called the Fred Whitten. It depends how long it's going to take, but it could be around 6.5 hours, 7 hours for a reasonable rider. And the number of people I've seen set off and not fuel properly and then blow before they get to the big climbs, hard nut rhinos, etc., and be in tears at the roadside just because they haven't fueled.
It's this technology has changed everything. We've also got the gaps between VT1, VT2, and how big the gap is from VT2 to your VO2 max. All of that you can extrapolate from, and then tailor that to what the individual needs are. So if you've got a certain characteristic but you're training for a race that's got a different characteristic, then you can alter your training to make sure that your physiology is more closely aligned to what you actually need to do, because you'll have data to work on.
And I guess the other sensors that are coming out that we see more of is like that's the one.
Yeah.
Glucose monitors. So how does that all play in then? How do you start to bring in the glucose monitor into the equation then?
So this is something we don't do here, but it's something that once people have had tests and I can see a need for it, I'll recommend it to people. These are ones from Abott. These are actually free at the moment. You can actually get a free sample, which are incredible.
Yeah, you think you reference it in your other video, yeah.
They are so useful because one, it will stop you, it will know the timing of that fueling.
Right.
This tells you how much you need, but this will start giving you insight as to the timing, as to how long it takes certain foods to actually be absorbed and start showing, in your blood. And it can take all sorts of people different lengths of time.
So that's pre-fueling and in-ride fueling. I mean, it's all relevant,
and all sorts. And trying to keep everything balanced, because even though you've got to keep eating all this very high sugar content food, you really don't want to, put your insulin system under a whole load of stress at the same time. You kind of want to keep everything, balanced. So this can really help people understand the importance of grazing and what foods really affect them and what foods don't, that sort of thing. For me, like oats just send me bonkers.
I love my porridge in the morning.
It's my poor insulin system would have like a bowl of porridge or like a flapjack is insane. So that's good. There's one more piece of the puzzle here that's not showing, and that is, this is for blood sugar. There's actually a device that's relatively new to the market where you can actually now look at muscle glycogen.
Okay.
That's the important thing people forget that, going from your digestion system into your blood is quite quick, but going into your muscle is quite a lengthy process. And we're often told at the end of a race, get glucose into you as soon as you can. Yeah. But the absorption into your muscle can vary between people. So one day we'll have one of those.
The other thing temperature is another one, in terms of body temperature, in terms of how you perform. Because I did a time trial last year. I did a 10-mile time trial down in Cambridge. It was that ridiculously hot day. I mean, it was like mid-30s, I think. And I was amazed at how my power just dropped away. And then that really got me thinking about temperature and performing in temperature and having the optimum body temperature. So what can we now do with the core sensor?
This is a core body sensor. It does still work on an algorithm. It still takes the skin temperature. It's not like it beams a laser beam into your body or anything. And it's still, but it has. I don't know whether it's accurate without putting a pill inside you. To be honest, but it's been dead interesting using these. I'm still finding my way through all this sort of stuff with the core temperature. But for me, when I'm standing next to someone, I'm going through these tests. Some people will sweat, some people don't sweat very much at all. Some people will feel hot and have to stop, and other people it doesn't affect them. And so this is starting to give me insight as to what's affecting people, and gives me some data points to see if we're making an improvement or not. That's the most important thing.
Well, I guess that's key, is to know what the status quo is, and then if things are drifting away from that, what's the impact? Because, I mean, I kind of know, but you don't know what variation, in terms of as temperature creeps up, body temperature creeps up, how's that in fact affecting your ability to put out power, to move forward, etc. I mean, how, what's the subtle variations and how big a difference does it make to performance? From
what I've been seeing so far, there are a few people that will suddenly get a very high spike. Some people will just get hotter and hotter and hotter naturally and will be able to cope with it. And there'll be a few people that seem to be at a certain point, and all of a sudden you see a big jump in temperature. They'll suddenly, all their physiology signs will change, be very red faced, like dripping with sweat, and they don't have a lot of time left before they've hit that zone. So that's been getting interesting. And how we train that out, I'm still experimenting with and researching and everything else. But this is again some technology that's going to
Well, a lot of the pros are using this as well, aren't they? I mean, I think that's a key part of their training strategy.
Yeah. What's interesting where they're putting them, because
Yeah.
if you sort of see how they're using them, they're not just using them on their heart rate strap like this is intended to, but they're also using it on the muscles. You'll see them using extra muscle, or even on their hats, like on their foreheads and stuff. So, again, this is something relatively new, and I'm still very much learning how to use it. Not so much learn how to use it, but how to use the data to inform stuff. But it definitely helps when someone's got questions. Oh, actually, I could see that in the data. Let's see if we can.
So we've got a whole collection of kind of tech here. I mean, what's the kind of key takeaways in terms of what people expect? I mean, what's the average rider out there? How can they expect to start to utilize this and get value from it then?
Yeah, here's the thing. Like, just as we came back at the start of this video about power meters being now in most people's houses. Yeah. I don't think we're long from seeing this sort of tech in people's homes. I honestly don't. I think this is now getting miniaturized enough. Education, this needs that educational leap, just the same as power meters did with intensity factor and TSS. Muscle oxygen saturation, I think, is going to be a word that's on people's lips more. Continuous glucose monitors is going to be commonplace in the household. There's either I have seen someone in development of a continuous lactate monitor, which would be insane.
That'd be insane. Mind you, these are banned, aren't they? You can't ride with these in the UCI. I might be wrong. It'd be too much of a help. I think.
You can train with them, but you're not allowed to use them in races and stuff. Yeah, because there's too much information about when you're fueling and stuff, which is
so how do you?
Quite telling.
Obviously, we talked at the beginning of this about we closed down the turbo studio in the form it was, and we want to now shift that facility into something different that really embraces a lot of what we're discussing here, but. So what do you think we should be thinking about as an organisation and the services that we could provide then?
Yeah, I think back to those early days, and people were coming to us with questions about how strong am I, how powerful am I, how do I get a data point which I can train to be better? Whatever that might be, your 3-minute critical power, your FTP, your 20-minute, whatever it is, power. We've got a data point, and if you can measure it, you can improve it.
Absolutely.
So this is all for me. We can measure it, we can improve it. So this gives me the data points of what we're going to do. This gives me insight as to why and how we change this. This is another piece of information that might impact why we're not performing in this certain metric.
So we could help people be more I mean, you wouldn't need to go and get a coach specifically after this. A lot of these data points we can guide people on a self-coaching journey then, really.
Yeah. Well, if you follow the self-coaching self-coach cyclist podcast, which I haven't updated for a while, to be fair, that's a big thing for me. I never really like coaching people like prescriptively. Sure. It suits some people. For me, it never suited me, so I always coach people that have got the same ideas as me, and that is I want to know enough to make my own intelligent decisions. So one of the things you'll hear from me is about intelligent decisions and triggering an adaptation. That's all we need to do. Is we need to do one little thing that's going to trigger a very small adaptation in the right direction.
Obviously the right direction.
And if it's peeing down with rain one day and you really don't want to go out on your bike, what can you do that day instead? As opposed to my coach says I have to go and do a 4-hour zone 2 ride today. I'll be like, nah, you're right, thanks. So that's always my coaching philosophy.
Being smarter in terms of what you're doing and more effective decision making and
know what it is you're trying to achieve, know what it is you've got the time available to do with the data, and go out there and make good intelligent decisions.
But that's not to say that I think coaches still have their role. It just depends what suits individuals, and coaches who could have athletes could send them to us, and we could then help give them some better data points that they can better coach to as well.
Oh yeah, absolutely. There's no doubt in my mind that the most effective coaching is one to have an athlete that is so enthusiastic and so fired up and so disciplined and motivated that they can follow a training program, and that training program is updated so regularly to reflect on performances. That is the way to win.
And I think that's absolutely the key with this technology, is because before you might meet with your coach and they would do a lot of tests which could only be done in certain environments, and the cost of doing them, to repeat them was very challenging, and it would only be maybe once or twice a year or whatever. Whereas now you can win virtually. I mean, it's almost continuous testing, and therefore potentially continuous adaptations and tweaks to.
Yeah, absolutely. So, for instance, when we're working with an athlete going towards their goals, we might test them at the very start. Right, this is what we need to work on. We might test them halfway through, and then probably test them with a few weeks to go before their event, just to see if we can just fine tune a few little things. And it's not that expensive. We can do this sort of stuff for about £100, depending on how much analysis you want to go with it.
So you reckon, Paul, after we've done a bit of kind of testing here, that we'll be able to ride Flanders and average 44.5 kilometres an hour?
Well, I'm probably getting a bit too old for that now. But yeah, I mean, if anyone puts the hours in, and with enough technology, then you can make some pretty big. We've got some athletes downstairs who are in their 70s and incredibly strong.
Well, I think that's the key thing, because people sometimes think, oh, this all doesn't apply to me. This is to that elite group of riders. But what's becoming more and more apparent to me is it's not about elite riders. It's about everybody can benefit from this, and the costs that might have prohibited every benefit have come down massively. And the fact that facilities like ours, we can provide that to the local community and people traveling to us. It's a very easy way of getting access to that data and access to learning how to use these tools yourselves.
Yeah, and it's even more important now because so many people are time crunched. Everyone's got families, lives, busy, commuting. There's that famous book, Time Crunch Cyclist, what you can do in 6 hours. If your 6 hours is all you can do a week and you can be absolutely pinpoint on target with it, you can be very effective with 6 hours of training.
Well, yeah, I mean, as somebody who trains I train a bit more than 6 hours, but I love to know that every minute I'm training is a productive minute and not a wasted minute. Mm-hmm. So the more data points I have to reinforce that and to make those decisions and corrections, that's a big plus to me, because nobody wants to waste time doing things that are non-productive.
No, the junk miles, so to speak. It's this one tells you what are the junk miles, what aren't, and it's not all about zone 2, because sometimes zone 3 is a very important place to train.
Everything has its place, but it's knowing that when you're doing something very specific, you are doing the right thing that you've intended to do, and it is delivering the result that you intended it to deliver.
So I'm hoping that this is the future. One, I'm finding it really, really interesting, because I think in the modern era, people were using Zwift, etc. at home, is that they're now coming to places like us for why aren't I getting better? I've been smashing it out on Zwift 4 nights a week, and my FTP stuck at 280 watts. Common.
I'm getting dropped on the club ride, and how do I not get dropped? Or
I'm always tired, and or I've been doing this thing and I can't get my time any faster, or I'm doing a crit race and I just can never get into the break. It's things like that. And okay, let's find out why. What's holding you back? Let's do some testing. Let's get some answers. Let's create a hypothesis. Let's test that hypothesis. Let's reevaluate, plan, do review, and
sounds great.
Yeah, we can get there.
I mean, so what sort of feedback would we like from our kind of audience, our viewers? I mean, what sort of opinions would you be interested?
If anyone's made it this far in the podcast, first of all, well done. This has got incredibly technical very quickly, and way outside our normal thing. So if you're still here with us, thank you.
You're obviously committed. It's like
I'm always keen to get feedback. It's always really important. Have you had your VO2 test? What did you learn for it? Did you get a good analysis? Has it changed how you train? Have you used things like Moxies and Cores? What are you learning from it? Because obviously we've got a wealth of data downstairs, but it's still, the bigger the data pool, the more the feedback, I think, accelerates learning massively. So.
I think that's a good point, Paul. I mean, we have deviated slightly from what we would typically have done on our kind of podcasts. And the reason we want to do that is because we want to provide more of a holistic, I mean, maybe you say it in your words, but...
it's our podcast, we can talk about what we want.
Well, exactly. And from my point of view, I mean, that's because I think it's not all about the bike, it's about the athlete as well. So we can do lots of great stuff with the bikes in terms of getting them perform at the highest level and help guiding people on the most effective bikes to use for what they're doing. But the next big parameter is the body, the athlete themselves. And I think, I use the word athlete. Everybody's an athlete in some form or fashion. And I think, we're now in a great position to be able to help guide people as how to best take advantage of this new tech that's coming out there, and it'll be commonplace.
Hope so. Yep. Cool. I think we should probably end this podcast here. Thank you so much for listening, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.
Back to normal next week, I promise.